Hi friends, and welcome back to No Book Left Behind. I'm your host Mark, and today I'll be discussing 3 more volumes of the British Library's Tales of the Weird series. Hi, and so today we're looking at 3 more volumes of the British Library's Tales of the Weird series. Now this is a roughly monthly publication they bring out as a paperback, which collects together macabre stories and tales from the early part of the 20th century and sometimes even earlier. And it's a great way to discover new authors and to check out ones that you've heard of but never got around to. So today we're looking at the 7th, 8th and 9th volumes that were published. Now you don't have to read them in any kind of order like I'm doing, it's just for convenience sake. And the first of those is this one, The Face in the Glass, The Gothic Tales of Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Now I'd never heard of Braddon, but I had heard of her most famous novel, at least as a title, Lady Ainsley's Secret. I've no idea what it's about. I don't think it's supernatural in any sense of the word, but I do know it's very popular with the classics community. Now, doing a little bit of quick research into Braddon's life, it appears she initially came from rather comfortable circumstances because she was privately educated. But it's likely that things went awry with the dissolution of her parents' marriage, because as a young woman she earned a living as an actress in order to support her and her mother. And this was the mid-1800s, and acting wasn't really a respectable employment, especially not for a young woman. She began writing in the 1860s and married publisher John Maxwell, and they lived together. But there was a slight problem. Maxwell was already married with 5 children, and his wife was still living, so this was quite the scandal of the day. And it doesn't appear that Braddon was taken for a ride by Maxwell in any way at all, because she acted as stepmother to those 5 children. And after Maxwell's legal wife passed away, the couple got married and had 6 more children of their own. So how she had the time to write anything is almost beyond belief, especially considering she wrote over 80 novels. Oh yes, and she also founded a monthly magazine called Belgravia, which she edited for more than a decade, at the same time as editing another magazine called The Temple Bar. Now, I haven't been able to find her YouTube channel yet, but I suspect she may have one, because even though she's passed away a long time ago, all that energy has to go somewhere, right? Now, her output was mostly what they called in the day sensational novels. These were kind of stories with elements of gothic and elements of romance, and generally touched on taboo subjects which weren't normally addressed in literature of their time. As far as I can tell, her work in the supernatural arena was limited to only short stories, because of course she wrote loads of those too. And 14 of them have been collected in this volume, The Face in the Glass, and it includes some of the best known examples of her work. Now this is a very well written and accomplished collection, if not a particularly memorable one. Braddon aims for subtlety in her approach, with inference more than any overt action or supernatural manifestations. So her heroes and heroines tend to succumb to more low-key diabolical influences. And this is a very worthy approach, of course, and to be applauded. However, I couldn't help wishing after a while that the ghosts would do something a little bit more substantial, if substantial is the right word to use in referring to ghosts. There's also evidence of a formula at work here. Most of Braddon's tales take place in old English country houses and involve the foretelling of the death of the lord of the manor or another prominent family member. The protagonists tend to be female and somewhat socially liberated for their time, which is to be admired, of course. However, now we have moved on somewhat, mostly, their actions seem less daring than they would have at the time, and so that blunts any social commentary that Braddon probably intended. My favourites here were The Chilling Tale of the Cold Embrace, the title story The Face in the Glass, and Herself, which is the story of a haunted Italian villa. But my absolute favourite was the closer of the volume, which is Good Lady Duquesne. Part of the reason this tale is so enjoyable is heroine Bella, who trips through the events of it in such a state of naive innocence that you can't help feeling that Braddon is having a little bit of fun at the reader's expense here, and spoofing the kind of outrageously virginal heroine of Gothic melodrama, which now seems such an outdated depiction of the female character. Now, I think this is a worthwhile collection of spooky tales, but I do think the forces of evil are far too polite and far too English for my taste, and in the end the volume failed to make much of a lasting impression on me. So now let's move on to the next in the series, which is The Weird Tales of William Hope Hodgson. And I've already spoken about this in one of my reading roundups, but let's give you a little bit more information on it. As I've mentioned a few times on this channel already, I'm a massive fan of this author, and I was very familiar with most of these stories, and the ones I wasn't, well, it's pretty likely I've read those at some point as well. There are 10 tales here, and 4 of them feature what's probably Hodgson's most famous creation, Carnacki the Ghost Finder, who is an expert on supernatural matters, who is typically brought in to investigate hauntings and other supernatural occurrences. One thing I've always loved about these tales is that the resolutions to them aren't always supernatural, and sometimes they're even quite ambiguous, and this gives them a sense of unpredictability which I particularly enjoy. Carnacki is also quite a compelling character, who even admits to acting out of fear on some occasions and fleeing the scene when things go south, although he always returns with his electric pentacle and other scientific paraphernalia. The other tales here are set aboard ships on the ocean. Hodgson ran away to sea at the age of 13 and spent over a decade as a sailor, so his tales of these strange creatures living in the vastly deeps are underpinned with an impressive level of nautical detail which helps give them a real sense of credibility. He also seems to have been obsessed with the Sargasso Sea, which is an area off the east coast of the United States, which has long been the subject of superstition and fear amongst the sailor community. It's the home to Sargassum seaweed, which often stretches for kilometres in great patches on the ocean surface and often features in Hodgson's stories. Of the Carnacki stories, my favourites are The Hog, The Horse of the Invisible and The Gateway of the Monster. Of the ocean stories, I particularly like The Voice in the Night, The Derelict and The Thing in the Weeds. And The Voice in the Night was actually the inspiration for rather a strange 1963 Japanese movie by the director Ishiro Honda, who of course brought us the original Godzilla picture. Now this is quite the creepy movie, which if you watch it you might dismiss on first view as just somewhat ridiculous, but it is a film that sticks with you, and if you like weird cinema as well as weird fiction, I'd certainly recommend you check it out. It's called Matango, sometimes it's called Matango Fungus of Terror, and it was released in America as Attack of the Mushroom People. But don't let that put you off. It's a good picture and well worth seeing. Now, I would not make any claims for Hodgson as a great stylist as a writer. His prose is mostly just functional, there's no real individual signature to it. But in a way that helps ground these outlandish tales in some kind of almost commonplace universe and doesn't break the spell that he's trying to weave. And he does demonstrate a truly weird and creative imagination, and that's probably the most important thing. In short, I think he's essential if you're into weird fiction, and this is a very solid introduction to his work. Now, the final book we're talking about today is Doorway to Dilemma, Bewildering Tales of Dark Fantasy, 19 stories curated and edited by Mike Ashley, who is responsible for quite a number of these Tales of the Weird volumes. Now, this is a very wide-ranging selection, mostly featuring authors whose names I did not know, although there are selections by H.G. Wells, by Arthur Machen, by Lord Dunsany, and Frank R. Stockton, who I've become familiar with very recently. Now, 4 of these writers are represented here by a pair of stories, the first of which was incredibly popular at the time but left unresolved questions, and a second story that provided those answers. Of those, the most famous is probably Stockton's The Lady and the Tiger, which is paired here with a story called The Discourager of Hesitancy, which is far less known, probably because it doesn't really supply any answers to the questions posed in The Lady and the Tiger, just raises more unresolved questions. The best of these dual entries for me were the ones by Muriel Campbell Dyer, The Woman in Red and Unmasked. And that's particularly because the resolution to the mystery posed by the first story is quite unexpected and fairly original for its time, I believe. But the biggest disappointment here for me was the Lord Dunsany tale, which is called The Hoard of the Ghibellines. Sorry, I thought I'd have to get that right. It's a very brief, almost a scrap of a story. And really, after hearing that Dunsany was a great inspiration to the incredible H.P. Lovecraft, I was expecting a lot more than what I got here. And I'm certainly not inclined to seek out any more of his work, having read this example. Similarly, I've been aware of Arthur Machen for very much the same reasons, an inspiration for Lovecraft. And if you saw my last book haul video, you'll know I got a very fine paperback of some of his most famous tales, which obviously I've not got round to reading yet. So this was my first time I had a chance to read one of his stories, and that is The White People. And what a weird experience it was. I would say probably weird fiction at its weirdest. Now the story is split into two separate parts. The first part is a discussion between two gentlemen on the nature of sin. And I have to say I found this very dry and a little boring. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, some of it did go over my head a little bit. But in the second part, one of the gentlemen lends the other a book, the Green Book to be precise, which is the journal of a 16-year-old girl. And almost the entire rest of the story is taken up with this text. And boy, is it strange. Somehow Machen manages to give this girl an authentic adolescent voice, capturing a youthful vibrancy and a dark energy that hints somehow at things forbidden and things just outside of reality. Most of the narrative details a journey, but it seems to be as much a journey into a mythological heart of darkness as a journey to a real location. It's really hard to describe this story and the quality that Machen evokes with his writing, but it's incredibly good, incredibly strange, and I'm really looking forward to reading more of his writing now. The other standout for me was a far more conventional tale called The Prism by Mary E. Wilkins. Now this is an original, poignant and highly memorable story about the temptations of conformity and settling for a role that society expects, but also addressing the advantages of actually making that compromise. And it's truly great little piece of work, and I was very impressed and immediately went to seek out the rest of her bibliography. And I found out that you're just as likely to know her as Mary Eleanor Wilkins, or even under her married name, Mary Eleanor Wilkins Freeman. And she wrote over 24 books of short stories and almost 20 novels. Most seem to be about New England life, with only about a dozen being under the category of weird fiction. However, the good news is that very helpfully the British Library have included a volume of her supernatural stories in the Tales of the Weird series. It's called Shadows on the Wall, and I think it's about number 28, so it'll be a while before I get round to it, but it does at least save me from doing a great deal of research and digging to try and locate the other particular tales of hers that I wish to read. And there are only a couple of make-weights here, one of which, surprisingly enough, is the H.G. Wells story, which is a very minor entry in his canon because he was a formidable writer of the shorter form. And I do have to give an honourable mention to a very strange story, which is called The New Mother by Lucy Clifford, which I think is kind of a modern equivalent of a Grimm's fairy tale, and I did enjoy that one very much. And overall, I think this is one of the strongest volumes in the Tales of the Weird series that I've read so far. And I am really so impressed by the amount of research that must go into selecting these stories and the impressive standard that they can come up with volume after volume. Whether that'll continue throughout the series, I don't know, but I'm certainly looking forward to my next 3 reads and reviewing them here on the channel. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for sticking with me right the way until the end. And if you did enjoy it, why not like, subscribe and ring that notification bell? It's much appreciated, and you can always unsubscribe later on if I get on your nerves. And in the meantime, keep seeking out those dusty second-hand bookshops in those narrow side streets of your town. Keep going to those car boot sales in the middle of nowhere and visiting those market stalls, because there are treasures out there that only you can find. See you later. And in the meantime...
Stop it.
And in the meantime, keep... Oh, for